Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Honourable members, I respectfully acknowledge that we are sitting today on the land of Aboriginal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I thank them as First Australians for their careful custodianship of the land over countless generations. We're very fortunate in this country of ours to have two of the world's oldest continuing living cultures in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose lands, winds and waters we all now share. Honourable members, I've spoken to you already this morning and I hope your morning has gone well. This Indigenous Youth Parliament program has been an integral part of the broader Queensland Indigenous Youth Leadership Program since 2009. In 2012, it was renamed as the Deeral Indigenous Youth Parliament in honour, as I mentioned earlier, of our first Aboriginal Member of Parliament, Uncle Eric. The Parliament is run and funded by the Queensland Parliamentary Service with support of Members of Parliament. In doing so, I want to acknowledge that we have John Paul Langbrook here, the Member for Surfers Paradise, who also has a role as the Shadow Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partnerships. Welcome, John Paul. This, of course, as I mentioned, is a unique opportunity for you. Now, I want you to sit in these chairs, soak in the atmosphere, and as I said, think about all of those people who've sat there before you, all of the decisions that have been made, and as I said, some have been positive decisions, many have not. And it's important that you recognise the history and all of us remember the past so we can plot forward with a brighter future for all of us. As I have also mentioned, this is a case of saying nothing about us without us, and that is very important. That's why your voices are so important here today. I want to acknowledge that we have got a number of different people who have supported today's events, and I will touch base on those as we go to the end. But let's all remember that leading is not about being elected. Leading is about showing a great example. It's about having advocacy for and in your community. It's about participating in the democracy that we live in and knowing when the appropriate time is to intervene and speak up and speak out. It's obviously, this program has given you those opportunities to understand those elements, and hopefully you've also been able to work through improving your writing and public speaking skills, and of course understanding those broader parameters of good governance and accountability. It's not an easy thing to stand in Parliament and give your speech, but as I said, don't be nervous, because this is your speech written by you with your sentiments, with what you wish to say and what you wish to advocate for. And that is something that no one else can deliver except you. So I hope you can enjoy your time here in the Parliament. I am really pleased to say that the turnout has been terrific across this whole program. It's been an opportunity for you to all come together, and I hope, as I said, the benefits for you today are not just what you will take back to the community in which you live in, but you will get those personal benefits from the process itself. I do want to speak finally with some words here from Tanisha Baker Honeyman, who attended the Queensland Indigenous Youth Leadership Program in 2017. She said, "The moral of my story is that from writing that speech in Parliament for Queensland's Indigenous Youth Leadership Program and being brave enough to stand up and present it, I've found my true passion and purpose, and I wouldn't have the confidence to pursue it without you." So, today, it's your opportunity. Speak up, speak out, be heard, and enjoy your time here in the Queensland Parliament. I call the Youth Premier,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships will today raise a motion 65,000 years in the making. The first course of business is to address that sovereignty was never ceded. First Nations people were here before, they are here now, and they'll be here in the future. Responsibilities of nurturing our lands, seas, and skies are to be recognised. This responsibility comes from the knowledge of the land. This motion is central to my vision for Queensland because it lays foundation for joint understanding. We are stronger together, the state of Queensland. We will be richer if this sentiment is We'll be stronger together and richer if the sentiments in this motion are not only adopted by this House, but also adopted by our state. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Youth Premier. Also, members, the timer is an indication only. I will be far more generous to you than I will be in the usual parliamentary timing. Is that correct, Member for Surfers Paradise? I call the Youth Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I want to share with the House my vision of Queensland. Today, I see a broken, divided country, and as Queensland, we can move forward as a united front. Our strong unity will make ripples throughout the country. First Nations cultures and knowledge is an enormous and important resource for Queensland. Without it, the knowledge of First Nations culture and history, we will not be able to move forward in the other movements. The knowledge and history of Australia's First Nations people will contribute to the rest of the movements for us to move forward as Queensland as a united front. So we need to take this opportunity to not make fools of Queensland and gain respect of our country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that this Youth Parliament acknowledges that 1. First Nations successfully govern their lands, seas, waters and air with associated resources for at least 65,000 years prior to British colonisation of Queensland. 2. Colonisation occurred without the consent of the First Nations and often against the active resistance of First Nations people. 3. First Nations have never ceded their sovereignty and continue to assert sovereignty. 4. Colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to First Nations societies and the wholesale dispossession of First Nations peoples of their lands, seas, waters and air. 5. First Nations responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. And 6. First Nations cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. I am pleased to support this motion and will draw attention of the House to the second and fourth sections of this motion. First, let the House consider the second point, particularly the phrases without consent and active resistance. Although a proud Wiradjuri woman myself, I was raised on Gumbaynggirr land and spent my childhood hearing the stories the elders in my community were willing to share with me. These stories hurt, but they hold power when they're shared. I was told about the women, pregnant women and children who were marched off cliffs at the Dorrigo Escarpment for reasons I will never be able to fathom. The cruelty of such acts, words like consent, will never be appropriate. Furthermore, let the House consider the fourth point, with specific emphasis on the term dispossession. I mentioned a moment ago that I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman. My great-grandfather was a member of the stolen generation, whose story defines dispossession. He was taken from his family, his culture, his land as a child, given a new name and story which he could never identify with. Dispossession was only the beginning of the hurt he and thousands of others have suffered through. These stories aren't fictions told to children in order to scare them into following the rules. I really wish that they were. They're the legacy forced on the Indigenous community by the British colonisation. Consequently, I consider each of the words in this motion with the gravity they deserve and am pleased to support them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Can I also remind honourable members that if you hear something you like, there's something that members made either during the speech or at the end, you can certainly give them a big hear, hear to show your support. Can I just ask you to give me a test run? I think you can do better than that. That sounds great. Well done. And I'll, at this point, hand over to the Honourable Member for Surfers Paradise, John Paul Langbrook, who will be assisting in the chair for some of this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now call the youth member for Aboriginal, the Shadow Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships.
Thank you. As a proud Aboriginal woman representing my ancestors and the line of strong women who have come before me, I wish to support the motion and directly speak to point 2 of this motion. I want to acknowledge that colonisation has had a devastating effect on our First Nations peoples and culture. It is important to continue to actively and collectively show our respect to our Indigenous peoples, laws, culture, land, seas and histories. By maintaining history and teaching it, we are walking towards a place of empowerment, unity and togetherness. In closure, it is important to address that our people have for generations acted in resistance, and yet we continue to rise with resilience. We continue to assert sovereignty for the people that have come before us and for those that will come after us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Shadow Minister. I now call the youth member for Giles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion, in particular of point 6, and acknowledge the land on which we meet today. First Nations cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. My ancestors before me have taken great care of the land for many years and have spiritual connections to the land. In addition, First Nations people have the knowledge to raise children, manage the land, and show mutual respect for people, as they have done successfully for thousands of years. Mr. Speaker, this is why it is important to acknowledge the First Nations cultures and knowledge of the land. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Giles. I call the youth member for Myers. Who's the youth member for Myers? I think it's an opposition member. Yes, I call the youth member for Myers. We're just going to get the microphone off if we can, because when... Okay, youth member for Myers. I call the youth member for Myers.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to support the motion that First Nation cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Mr. Speaker, I want to bring forward to the House the importance of our cultural heritage. The important part my daughter, Sunny, will play in the development and future of Queensland. Mr. Speaker, I believe that by moving this motion, my daughter will be provided the opportunity to grow and prosper during a time when our culture and heritage are being embraced by all Queenslanders. This motion is about acknowledging the past, but more importantly, acknowledging our future. Mr. Speaker, a future where my daughter fully appreciates her culture whilst also influencing the wider community. Mr. Speaker, I want my daughter to echo the same message which I just heard today, which I think is particularly important, and I'll end it with this. There's nothing about us without us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Myers. I call the youth member for 4 Mile.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to talk on the motion brought forward to the House. I agree with it all. I move that this youth parliament acknowledge that First Nation cultures is important to my community because of the lack of youth mental health that leads into feeling disengaged from language, connection to their traditional land. I feel as if I relate more to this motion, and this is why I want to educate myself on the First Nations culture and knowledge from others in the Queensland Indigenous Youth Leadership Program. In doing this, I made the first step of applying for QUILP, and I intend on taking the knowledge back to my community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, youth member for 4 Mile. I call the youth member for Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion, which I agree with, that First Nation cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Me standing here today is a result of my people who have gone before me, my strong ancestors who have passed on our culture and knowledge, and it is alive and thriving and ready to be shared. No longer should there be a divide, and we as members of Youth Parliament need to stand together to make Australia united. Let us be a nation that not only rises, but leverage this opportunity to acknowledge the First Nations people's roots, because that is our foundation to support and move forward, bringing forth a multicultural front. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, youth member for Purcell. I call the youth member for Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion, specifically the first point. First Nations successfully governed their lands, seas, waters and air and associated resources for at least 65,000 years prior to British colonisation of Queensland. Mr. Speaker, despite what we have suffered and lost through colonisation, we are and continue to be one of the longest living cultures who successfully governed their lands, seas, water and air. Queensland, Australia and the world are looking to us as First Nations people for sustainable solutions to address these issues. We want our children and their children to experience the lands, seas, waters and air how our ancestors did so over 65,000 years ago. We want our children to live with the land how our ancestors did. We want our children to fish the seas that our ancestors did. We want our children to swim the waters that our ancestors swam in. And we want our children to breathe the air that our ancestors did. Mr. Speaker, therefore, by passing this motion, we have the ability to thrive as proud Murris and Queenslanders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Harris. I call the youth member for Malone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this motion with specific respect to point number 5. Our First Nations people have walked on this land for generations and have a spiritual connection to the land, water, seas, and the airs. As First Nation people, we have inherited an obligation and a responsibility to continue to take care and nurture our land, traditional laws, and our customs. This significant responsibility, however, takes many forms. We must continue to strive to be spiritually connected with and to our land. We must continue to be united and operate with one voice. And finally, we must strive to keep our Indigenous languages strong and alive, to keep our connection to our land strong. Therefore, by moving this motion, Mr. Speaker, we can collectively take a step in the right direction in ensuring we can continue to heal and that our culture and identity remains united. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Malone. I call the youth member for Beatson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support on motion 6, First Nations culture and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. We are the longest living culture in Australia for the last 65,000 years. We are strong and we are powerful, and we are more than just a resource. We are more than just an item. Wow. I respect this motion. We need to unite and celebrate as a multicultural front and walk together as one on our land. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Beats. And members, can I also just advise honourable members that members can hold notes. Members don't have to feel like they're not allowed to hold their notes. So some members in the normal parliament, regular parliament, will hold notes. Some don't. There's nothing wrong with holding your notes and reading from them. So don't feel that you have to, members shouldn't feel that they have to have them on the desk and look down, because sometimes if you've got notes and you might be holding your notes and you're referring to them, but then that means that you can keep your head up a bit more and people can see that you're referring to a note. There's no shame in having a note. No one can give a speech all the time without having anything to refer to. So I just give that guidance to honourable members in case you're not sure, in case honourable members are not aware of that. I'm going to call, thank you, Member for Beats, and I call the youth member for Unopon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support these motions, in particular motion 4. I recognise the devastating colonial disruptions and the disconnection to our ancestral lands, resulting in a loss of continuation of our sacred ancient cultures, kinship systems and First Nation sovereignty. As a First Nations woman, I feel the full effects of colonisation in my bloodline due to the heavy intergenerational trauma that has been passed down to me due to the forceful removal of my granddad from country to Palm Island Mission and his mother. Mr. Speaker, as I've experienced these traumas, I will continue to support these motions and fight for my people's sovereign kinship and cultural rights.
Thank you, Member for Unopon. I now call the youth member for Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to support the motion that colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations and often against the active resilience of First Nations people. The reason I support this motion is because as a young Indigenous man, listening to the history of the colonisation and knowing the results it's had on my elders and people before me has really encouraged me to spread the word on the colonisations. The strongest part of us is our resilience. For over 200 years, we have continued to fight to be acknowledged for our connection to the land, seas, and air. Therefore, I'm pleased to support this motion ahead. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Heiss. I call the youth member for Rose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion point 4, which I support, being colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to First Nation societies and the wholesale dispossession of First Nation people of their land, seas, waters and air. Mr. Speaker, there's one point I'm going to talk about, which are social problems. I grew up in an Aboriginal community my whole life, and I've witnessed that firsthand disruption colonisation has caused to my community. I believe this is due to the lack of connection to our culture and our ancestral lands. There are many ways we can address this issue, which is a recognition of the social problems I have mentioned. Therefore, I support motion point 4. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, youth member for Rose. I call the youth member for Goolagong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to share my thoughts with the House. I want to support this motion. First Nations governed their land, seas, waters, airs and associated resources for 65,000 years, and at least prior to the Britain colonisation of Queensland, which I think is absurd, Mr. Speaker. There was no consent to this colonisation. There was and this actually caused intergenerational trauma and a suffering amongst our people. Also the cause is a high risk of mental health, which then led to a high increase of suicide. Nevertheless, the cultures and knowledge of, not cultural knowledges, are a huge resource to our people of Queensland. But again, may I remind you that the colonisation has had effect on the Indigenous communities, as there has been a loss of cultural practices and knowledge. As a result, I do support the motion. I ask that the House take notes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Youth Member for Goolagong. I call the Youth Member for Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the attention of the House to support Motion 2 that colonisation occurred without the consent of the First Nations and often against the active resistance of the First Nation people. In 1717, James Cook had declared Australia as terra nullius, which means no one's land. In fact, it was estimated that there was over 750,000 Aboriginal people who had settled on this country. Did James Cook declare Australia as terra nullius because at the time there was no Aborigines or anyone in sight, or was it because there was no significant land markings that determined that Australia was in fact inhabited? Since this landing had occurred, colonisation of the First Nation population had decreased by 90%. In 1992, an Murray Island man named Eddie Mabo had won the native title land rights case, and it was ruled that the land belonging to no one upon European settlement was wrong, and it was in fact that Indigenous people have lived in Australia for thousands of years and enjoyed their rights to their lands according to their customs and laws. As a result of colonisation had occurred without the consent of the First Nation people, there's evidence and facts that support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Pearson. I call the member for Dingo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion that you brought forward today. I am supportive of this motion that First Nation culture and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. As one of the longest living cultures, Australia has a rich and significant history that needs to be at the forefront in understanding and embracing both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Spreading and recognising Indigenous Australian culture benefits the whole of Australia and the people that visit this country. Embracing our First Nation culture increases people's understanding of how we used to live off the land and how our traditions and values are still prominent today. When people learn about our culture, they have a better appreciation and understanding, which decreases many stereotypes and assumptions. By simply increasing truth-telling, creating connections and sharing, this would put Queensland ahead in having reconciliation and closing the gap. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Dingo. I call the Youth Member for Lindgren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion, First Nation cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Mr. Speaker, in my community, the use of traditional knowledge, including cultural healing processes, can support First Nation Queenslanders to successfully sustain physical, mental and spiritual health. However, myself, along with many others, are disconnected from our cultural knowledge. What we do know is that this knowledge does still exist, and if we don't focus on and maintain this knowledge and its values, there is potential to lose it forever. Mr. Speaker, Queensland is lucky because we have members in our community that still hold the traditional knowledge. This knowledge has potential to impact all Queenslanders. Therefore, I want this to be recognised as an enormous resource by all Queenslanders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Lindgren. I call the Youth Member for Anu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion First Nation responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. As a proud young Torres Strait Islander, I am passionate about keeping our youth connected to their culture, and the way we do that is by walking our lands, fishing in our seas and waters, as well as practicing our cultural customs throughout our everyday lives. This is what has happened in previous generations, and this is what will happen for thousands of generations more.
Thank you, Member for Anu. I call the Youth Member for Namatjira.
Dear Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to support this motion. In my speech this afternoon, I will be specifically talking about motion point 1 and 6. In regards to motion point 1, it has been proven that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people successfully governed the land, sea, water and air in the past. We had protocols, law, custom and tradition that were followed and passed from generation to generation for 65,000 years and longer. Furthermore, point 6 is very important Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland and should be taught to everyone. Because of the points I have spoken about, I fully support the motion. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Namatjira. I call the youth member for Casa Daly.
I draw the attention to the House to support the motion that the First Nations' responsibilities for their land, seas, water and air in accordance with their laws and customs. Back in the dream times, thousands and thousands of years ago, our ancestors walked these very earths that we're on now. Mr. Speaker, I want you to know how our ancestors survived those many years. We survived by nurturing, preserving and teaching our next generation our rich culture. The laws of our land tells us that we must take care of our land and in return we receive all that we need. As a result, this is why I believe that the First Nations peoples are and should be responsible for their land, seas, water and air. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Casa Daly. I call the youth member for Mailman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although I accept the motions of 1 and 4, it is difficult to accept motion 5 in its current form. Through colonisation and the removal of First Nations people from their traditional lands, it needs to be recognised that some people never grew up on country and never received such knowledge on how to look after, care for, and be responsible for their land, seas, waters, and air. It is difficult to say that First Nations people have a responsibility to continue without first acknowledging that there were and still are existing laws that prevent First Nations people from exercising those responsibilities. A further discussion must be had before we can say that Indigenous people have a responsibility to continue looking after the lands. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mailman. I call the youth member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak upon the motion and I am pleased to support the motion of point 6. First Nation cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Today I want to share with the House about my life and issues that I personally face throughout everyday society as a First Nation person. Stereotypes such as walking into a shop and just instantly being followed around, being accused of basically not so good things, but other issues such as discrimination is one of the biggest issues Australia is facing. Being discriminated against the colour of our skin. We need to start educating each other on that issue. Because I believe that Australia can move forward together as one if we all put our mind and contribute to building a better nation for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Bennelong. I call the youth member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House on the First Nations' successful governance of their lands, sea, water and air for at least 65,000 years prior to colonisation. Mr. Speaker, I want to emphasise the word successful. In the past decade, I would not account that non-Indigenous management of the land has been successful. The bushfires that raged Queensland at the start of 2019 and into 2020, burning 18.6 million hectares of land, is the reality of our inability to maintain a country that deserves its traditional owners to reclaim their right to successfully govern their land once again. Mr. Speaker, without reintroducing traditional land management and respect for country, coordinated by Indigenous Australian leaders, we will continue to see the great state of Queensland burn and drown. That is not successful. Thus, I support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Lingiari. I call the youth member for Dodson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I want to share with the House as to why I support this motion. I'd like to speak on Section 6. First Nations culture and knowledge is an enormous resource that Queensland is not only missing out on, but that we can use in everyday life. Growing up, I learned another country's culture and language before I learned my own culture and language. However, since learning my own culture and understanding the resources that our culture has, I have been able to use this knowledge and skills to be able to do the things I do today. And that's mentoring, supporting, and equipping young people to make a change in our community. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, by moving this motion, if we were to use the culture and knowledge from the First Nations people, we can have people succeeding. We can have people in Parliament, and we can have people making a change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Dodson. I call the youth member for Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion of point 3. The First Nation has never ceded the sovereignty and continue to assert the sovereignty. My own grandmother was taken away from her own tribe. She was put into a mission where she lost the touch of her own brothers and sisters. Her culture was lost and our language was lost. Our ancestors were enslaved and killed. It is now our duty to make sure that the challenges of the past are not repeated. Our language and our culture and our identity is valued. Our future generations are depending on motions like this one, Mr. Speaker, as it embeds its importance of strength of serenity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. I call the youth member for Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion that I support that First Nations cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Mr. Speaker, we see First Nations traditional knowledge that have been passed down, bringing us modern inventions that have been harnessed worldwide. The aerodynamics of helicopter propellers were derived from the traditional boomerang. We also see this through First Nations' use of backburning our land to prevent out-of-control bushfires and the devastating effects it has on our native flora and fauna. Mr. Speaker, First Nations knowledge is invaluable. Mr. Speaker, the desecration of our culture has have resulted in an Indigenous youth mental health crisis. First Nation culture brings us our sense of identity and is important for our well-being and ties our community together. Mr. Speaker, the solution to our Indigenous mental health crisis is culture and knowledge. And this is why culture and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I call the youth member for Mabo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a proud Purma-like woman, I am pleased to support the motions. First Nations successfully govern the land, seas, waters, air, associated resources for at least 65,000 years. Prior to British colonization of Queensland, and First Nations responsibilities for their land, sea, water, and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. Furthermore, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people occupied this land since the beginning of time. And this is shown through stories, sacred landmarks, ceremonial practices, songline, and dance. Traditional practices depict connection to country, to the land, the sea, and waters that has been performed from generations to generations and passed down orally from a father to his son and a mother to a daughter. In addition, for generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been embedded with the knowledge of the importance of looking after country, the land and sea, and all its resources. It is our duty of care to ensure traditional cultural practices are performed in accordance with traditional law and when I say law, L-O-R-E, and customs to ensure this traditional knowledge continues to be taught throughout the future generation. The land and sea is a sacred place. It holds the memories and footprints of those who walked before us to pave the way, and that is why it is vital for us to protect it. Therefore, I would like to close by quoting a message from a very respected Purumagal elder that's been taught to us from a young age. Ina lag nitamud yadainga mamu yawai kri. The land is yours, you must take care of it. Ina mal nitmun yadainga mamu yawai kri. The sea is yours, you must take care of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mabo, for your contribution. I call the youth member for Christian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion that us, the First Nations people, and our cultures are an enormous resource for Queensland. We still and always will have a strong connection to our land. As prior to colonisation, we maintain an entire nation that flourished. Thus, I want to reiterate the importance of supporting the motion, in particular the sixth point, that the First Nations culture and knowledge is an enormous resource for Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Christian. I call the youth member for Gulpilil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion of the First Nations culture and knowledge being an enormous resource to all of Queensland. Mr. Speaker, today I share my argument why this is so important to Queensland, to not only the Indigenous but all of the non-Indigenous people. As one of the longest living cultures, we have suffered and had to fight for where we are today. Although it's not where we would like to be, it's important to educate everyone about the culture we have created along the way. For 500 years, we've been forced to learn about the British history. So I believe it's our turn to talk about the 65,000 years of Indigenous culture and knowledge, such as the awareness and respect for our culture, our land, and our ways, including everything we continue to fight for today. Mr. Speaker, I refer to my above statement that the First Nations culture and knowledge is an enormous resource to all of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Gulpilil. I call the youth member for Chulbra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion that First Nation cultures and knowledge is an enormous resource for not only Queensland but for everyone, specifically within the Education Department. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and knowledge needs to be embedded into schools. Every morning I go to work as an Indigenous teacher aide because I want the best future for our kids. It is important that our youth continue to connect to their culture. This culture and knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation cannot be lost. Now is a time for change. I want to work with Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff and students within my school to promote our cultures and knowledge. We need our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth to be proud of who they are. And we want our Queensland's children to cherish our beliefs and our values. This is why First Nation cultures and knowledge is an important resource for Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Chulbra. I call the youth member for Hayman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion, as I have seen and experienced the effects of colonisation, which occurred without the consent and often against the active resistance of First Nation people. I have lived a life without knowledge or opportunity to speak my native language. I have minimal experience practicing my cultural traditions, and I have spent countless of hours trying to path my family connections, all a result of colonisation. For generations, we have worked towards reconnecting with what was stolen in order to find not only our identity, but our place in a nation that we never willingly gave up. This is why I'm in support of the motion, and in particular point 2, that colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations and often against the active resistance of First Nations people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hayman. I call the youth member for Bandler.
I am pleased to support this motion. However, this acknowledgement is a disingenuous and superfluous performative act if not followed by action. Article 6 of this motion emphasises that the Indigenous culture is an enormous resource of the state, but without representation of the strong Indigenous voices at the forefront, this resource is not being used to its full extent and the motion stands for naught. So whilst we are moving forward with momentum and purposeful intention, a perfunctory acknowledgement is nothing without our voices. This is why I am humbled and excited by the people in this room. I am proud to support this motion because I am proud of the people who bring it. This acknowledgement will hold powerful symbolism and be a beacon of recognition and an ignition of hope for our people. With us as a future, this acknowledgement will be of significance and will be the first of our great successes. Because we are the people, we are the voices, and we are the motion.
Thank you, Honourable Member for Bandler. Is there anyone on the speaking list that I've not called? Well, can I say before I put the question to the House how I enjoyed the contributions? Can I also say that there's nothing wrong with getting emotional when members make contributions. We had a condolence motion, which is for a former Member of Parliament, only in the last sitting week, in the budget week, that went for 2 hours. And there were a number of honourable members who showed a lot of emotion because they'd had close connections with that particular MP. So there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's quite amazing that in a speech that goes for a minute, that you can feel yourself feeling that emotion, which shows the effect of being in this chamber, which has a slightly unusual effect that you're sort of in on top of each other in terms of looking at each other, and it really does create an effect that you would not believe it could have that effect on you when you're giving a speech that goes for a minute. Admittedly, the member for Marbo's speech went for a lot longer than a minute, but we won't bring that up. But well done. So now I'm going to put the question, members. The question is that the motion moved by the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partnerships be agreed to. Those who are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Divide. A division has been called. Ring the bells for 1 minute.
Close the bars. The question is that the motion be agreed to for which a division has been called. Will the government whip advise what the government votes are for the ayes or noes? Will the opposition whip advise what the opposition votes are for the ayes or noes? Fifteen noes? 15 ayes. I'm a little confused why a division was called. I'm glad to see everyone is in furious agreement. The result of the division is ayes 36, noes 0. There being fewer than 5 votes recorded in the negative, this vote will not be recorded in Hansard. Thank you, honourable members. I've listened very carefully to your contributions and they were magnificent. Well done, and we'll have more to say about that a little later on this afternoon. But you've done yourselves proud, your families proud and your communities proud. Terrific effort. It's now time for us to break for lunch adjournment. So we look forward to hearing a little bit more about some of your personal stories over a bite to eat.